I don't know. Maybe it's just a me thing, but to be very honest, I feel like it's been a while since I did this. Considering that in my earlier days, it was a thing that made me, I guess, relatable and liked by my earlier listeners, I feel like it's about time I talk to the boys for a little bit. I holla at the homies, I have a discussion on something that's very homie related. Interestingly enough, the women will probably thank me for this as well, because this is something that I guess they've also been trying to push across. But for the most part, this was actually sort of inspired by a video that I was watching again on IG. And, it kind of brought up some things that I've noticed, some stuff that I've spoken about, but essentially just, something that I feel should be compiled. But to kind of give a little bit of context and, explain everything, I should probably start things in a much better way and, not sound like I lack manners. So, welcome to Breaktime on West Side, your number one breakdown podcast, coming to you from Nairobi, Kenya. The man on the mic is Sir Denver B. This is a shortened, less edity, less fluffy, no instrumentally version of the podcast where I just get to kind of, air out some of my intricate thoughts and, not have to throw in a bunch of news and like rants in there and, just sort of have a little bit more of an intimate feel about it, because it's not like I'm trying to manufacture what I think of as a full-on episode. And speaking of full-on episodes, I will be returning to those in a little bit, but before I get to that, there was a video that I stumbled across which kind of ignited some thoughts about some things that I've discussed before in regards to, men and some of their interests and, where some of those influences are. So without further ado,
what's your age?
19.
29. I like them young.
How does a 10-year age gap relationship work?
Perfect age gap for a relationship.
Why?
Well, see, when they're 19, you can train them. You can train them, They're very young, so, you can influence them and train them to be the perfect woman for you.
Do you feel like that's true?
Yes.
Do you feel like your boyfriend is misogynistic?
No.
Why not?
I don't know. I mean, I'm fine with our relationship. It has worked for us. Guys my age are not, mature enough.
And would guys your age be able to provide the same things that he provides for you right now?
Of course not.
Why go 19 as opposed to 29 or 35?
She's a young sweetheart, what can I say?
Okay, so what's the latest you want to have kids?
5 years, to now, yes.
Yeah, biology gives women up to about the age of 27. So I say you got about 8 years in it, so.
So this was a clip that was put out on IG and, I saw it, and as usual, I feel like I've discussed this a little bit where I've mentioned how this whole age gap thing and this whole thing of going for younger babes like the 23, 22, 21 and even the 19s and sometimes the 18s just wasn't really my cup of tea. It's something that I'm not a particularly big fan of. Not that I have anything against women of that age, just mostly because I feel like there's such a massive gap in maturity that it's like we might not entirely get each other. And mind you, I'm saying all of this and I'm 27 years old. So when I hear a 29-year-old dating a 19-year-old and he's like, oh, a 10-year age gap is like the perfect difference and everything, and it works because you can mold her into quote-unquote the perfect woman, this isn't the first time I've heard guys talk about that. I hear guys talking about that in relation to women of a certain age, women from a certain part, say rural, urban, and also women who seem to be doing pretty well for themselves professionally and are thus particularly independent women. I see and I hear guys talk about these discussions and talk about how they prefer the other as opposed to what it is that they're used to seeing on a day-to-day. And to be honest, I usually start to wonder if what most of these guys say is what they think is going to make the grass green on the other side, and yet that's not entirely the case. Because when I think of the whole idea of dating a 19-year-old, all right, let's look at, the whole 29 to 19-year-old difference. If you were telling me that this was something that dude was doing in the 1800s or the early 1900s, I would say fine, makes sense. Mostly because I know that a 19-year-old during those times and a 19-year-old right now are two very, very different sorts of 19-year-olds, all right? And I usually just chalk it down to responsibility, because responsibility creates maturity, and maturity is what makes you more equipped to deal with the challenges of the world. So you look at, the older days, the 19-year-old had a bunch of responsibilities. She had work to do in the house. She was probably taking care of a younger sibling or a younger relative or something of the sort. Or she was already doing some work courtesy of the mother moving some of the chores and placing them onto the daughter's shoulders and shit. And that would sort of build a certain sense of character. You look at a 19-year-old today, and there's a pretty good chance that besides school, the only other thing that she's had to have as a responsibility is getting a driver's license. All right? So do you think that that would make them a much better suitable person, at least in terms of knowing themselves, that they'd be a good enough adult that you can try and do life with? Like, I don't think that they're sure enough of themselves before they can even be sure enough that you'd be someone that they're willing to devote the best years of their life to be with. And I won't even get into the whole, probably they're just fucking around because they've joined university and they have a bunch of attention and shit and they're trying to take advantage of you for money. Like, I don't want to get into that, because even though I could make that argument, it's not like it's every 19-year-old or every babe who's in her early 20s that's doing that. So I can argue this out purely just based on maturity. Like, you see that, you hear that, and then now you bring it to the Kenyan context as well, and there's someone who's telling you to get a babe from the village as opposed to a babe from the city, because these city babes have been run down and they've been choking on dicks for most of their best years. So, like, you sit back and you think about it, because personally, I thought that was a talking point that, like, originated during my dad's time when he was trying to get married. And it sort of really picked up with quite a number of the millennials before at some point it ended up being shot down. And I don't get why the resurgence is back, but it is. And you kind of think about the dudes that like saying such things, and personally, I usually hear that and I wonder if these guys are actually very conversant with what happens in village areas or in more rural areas. Like I said in the episode Kienyeji versus Broiler, like, these babes could be screwing different Boda guys and no one's ever really going to know, because a lot of those guys tend to live in their own isolated houses, much as their neighbors, and someone can spot one thing or another. Like, you mostly won't be able to know shit because it's not like there's cameras and enough people within a close proximity to spot that shit. Then on top of that, provided that they know who the hell it is that gossips and they avoid them, and they do that shit in the privacy of a bush somewhere, or, in the houses under the guise of inviting someone over for tea, you probably won't know shit. Also, they have a lot less to lose from a reputational standpoint on which nigga they choose to shag. So there's a pretty good chance that out of the 5 guys that the city babe would have banged, she bangs one, the village babe could probably end up banging all 5. But guess what? There's a dude that's gonna be like, go for the kienyeji babe because she isn't as run through as the city babe. Which kind of leads me on to the other stereotype that other niggas like to have, which is where they're like, go for a babe that is dependent. Don't go for the ones who are very career oriented and make a lot of money, because those ones are the ones that will be intimidating and they usually tend to have very masculine energy, blah blah blah, never letting the man lead, blah blah. And well, granted, I know that one was something that was sort of really in contention, especially during COVID when these topics were really coming up. And people were talking about how they don't like independent women because independent women have very masculine energy and they won't let you lead and they're not willing to be submissive, blah, blah. And granted, even for someone like me who, when I started this podcast, I said I'm a fan of independent women, I was actually sort of swayed sort of against them. But over time, I still think back to why it is that I used to like independent women back in the day, and I still kind of do like them right now. The ability of someone, a grown human being, to pretty much take care of themselves and not have to depend on you to take care of their basic needs is actually a pretty good thing. Someone who doesn't depend on you for money is actually a really good thing, because you, as a guy, can actually date them knowing full well that they're not just trying to be with you for whatever money that you have or lack thereof. Because, a lot of guys talk about how they don't want a gold digger and how, they'd want a babe that is supportive but allows them to pay the bills. But at the end of the day, you're like, yes, you want to do that, but first of all, I don't think there's that much gold to dig. And that's been an arguing point that a lot of women have sort of made against guys who talk about women only wanting them for money. And it's a very valid argument, but at the end of the day, if you make a shit ton of money, then how else will you know that the person that expects you to pay all of her bills and then some isn't trying to date you just for the money? And you actually don't. If you're with an independent woman, it's easier for you to figure that out because she's okay paying for her own shit and does not need you to pay for whatever shit that you think you should be paying for her, because she's been doing pretty well on her own. And even though you were to leave, she can still take care of herself, which means that if you're going to pay for something, it's because she wants you to pay for it or because you want to pay for it. It's not because you feel like you have to because you're dating this particular person. Which, when I kind of think about it, takes me back to the main reason why I actually liked independent women. That simplicity, knowing that, the money's out of the picture because she makes her own money, you make your own money. And it's not like she's trying to hop on to be with you because of a bag. And, you guys can focus on actually having a genuine relationship based on genuine desires for each other. It's not like it's monetarily related and, it's not one of those ones where you're going to have to come up with a shit test where you can see if your babe, wouldn't mind financially supporting you or some shit. Like, for the most part, I think that kind of alleviates a lot of the stress for a lot of guys, much as they try to avoid independent women. And, at the end of the day, when you kind of look at it, I feel like when you look at these three debates that guys usually have, the whole kienyeji versus broiler, the whole, younger women versus older women, the whole dependent versus independent women, you kind of come to a point where you realize that there's a lot of guys that generalize a lot of shit and they do not know the reality on the ground. And they come up with this supposed narrative and this supposed mindset of what, their ideal woman is supposed to be like, look like, and at what age she's at, which can very, very much skew them away from the kind of women that they'd probably be better off being with. Because at the end of the day, I will tell you for a fact, I do not think that I can do very well with a chick who's in her late teens or her early 20s. And I'm 27 years old. So when a guy who's in his late 20s or early 30s or even going to his 40s is saying that he's interested in such a babe, I'm also sort of curious as to why it is they have an interest for someone who's that much younger than them. But all in all, to kind of conclude all of this, let me just say that whenever I usually hear a lot of young guys talking about how, they're not going to marry until their much later years and they're going to look for a babe who's under the age of 25 because that time they'll be millionaires and they can take care of a babe like that and they can mold them well. I usually sort of smile because I know that most of those standards that they're setting are standards that aren't even theirs. It's just some people that they've listened to online that have given them that idea of that's how they're supposed to be living their lives and, trying to date women. And even when I hear older guys saying that, that's pretty much the same thing that I usually run back to. Because if you think that every babe between the ages of like 25 going to, 30 plus is some rundown babe who has pretty much handled like 50 plus dicks in her lifetime and she's just trying to settle down because she's hitting the wall. If that's what you think of the women that are around your age or possibly older or maybe even younger, then I would simply just tell you to go out and touch grass. Or to not use a metaphor to it, I will tell you to walk out and go and meet with other women who aren't in your particular circle of friends and just have an open conversation with some of them. Because you'll realize that there's a lot of these babes who, in as much as they may have stayed such a long time before getting married or they haven't settled down when they're in the early 20s, like, you find that quite a number of them didn't even take that much dick. You find that quite a number of them are in that position because they chose to chase a career. Or you find that some of them just simply stayed at home. Like, they never really got out much, and they didn't get a chance to date as much. They didn't get a chance to interact with people so that they can get a potential mate or potential mates. And as such, you're busy discounting an entire group of women based off of the mindset of some guy on the internet that probably isn't even living up to the same shit that he's telling you. Although, then again, I might be wrong about this shit, so I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open on IG, on Facebook. It is at Breaktime, on Westside, on Twitter. It is at Bagaka the D. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.